There are many different ways to write SQL. I'm not talking about the different dialects we discussed in the introductory videos. I'm talking about the actual style of writing SQL. In my career, I've seen many different styles, and my own style has evolved considerably from when I first began writing SQL. I write SQL the way I do because it's easy for me to read and work with, and most experienced SQL developers will say the same thing about their own styles. In this video, I just want to discuss ways to format your SQL and introduce you to some different methods. You've probably noticed by now that when I write SQL in pgadmin, I'm using a particular format. For instance, if we look at the following query, you'll see that each clause of my query starts on a new line, and I use the tab key to indent new lines within each clause, which keeps my SQL clauses logically grouped together. Whenever I add a new column to either my select or group by clauses, I add a comma at the start of the new line, rather than at the end of the previous line. I do something similar in my where and having clauses, where you can see I add conditions with the and or operators on subsequent lines. Starting new lines in each clause like this is how I learned to write SQL, and I like it because it makes it easy to comment out lines of code after the first line of each clause. For example, if I need to comment out the last name column, I just add the dash dash to those two lines, and my code works fine. However, if I wrote my SQL in a style where I put my commas at the end of each line, like what you see in front of you now, and I just commented out those two lines, the same as I did before, my SQL is actually invalid. When I run the query, I get a syntax error because there's a comma at the end of my group by clause. To make the SQL valid, I need to go back into my code and add a third comment before the comma at the end of my group by clause, and now my query will run successfully. And the same goes for the additional lines in my where and having clauses. If I comment out either first name not equal to Kim or count1 equal to 2, my SQL fails again because my where clause has an and operator trailing at the end of it, and my having clause has a trailing or operator. So to fix this, I have to add more comments to remove those trailing operators. And now my SQL is starting to look really sloppy because I've got comments everywhere. Over years of writing SQL, I refined my style and eventually decided which techniques I like best. It's just what works for me. Technically speaking, there's no correct style for writing SQL. Your SQL is not wrong if you put commas at the end of your lines, what I call trailing comma style. Or if you do them at the beginning, like I do, which I call leading comma style. And you don't need to put keywords like select and order by in all capital letters. You can actually write them in all lowercase because SQL is usually not a case-sensitive language. In fact, when I normally write SQL, I usually write in all lowercase style because for me, it's faster and easier and doesn't make the code any more difficult to read. So, what other ways of writing SQL are there? I'll show you a few different examples using a free online tool. Redgate Software is a company based in Cambridge, England, a city that is very near and dear to my heart. Redgate makes awesome tools for working with Microsoft SQL Server and Oracle databases. And one free tool they make available is their SQL Formatter. To view the SQL Formatter, you can open your browser and go to redgate.com/website/SQL-formatter. Once you're there, you can paste your SQL into the box in the center of the website, then use the red button that says Format the SQL to see the formatter's recommended changes. I'm going to use a snippet of code from earlier in our Week 1 lessons to demonstrate. Notice how, in my example, I have collapsed all my code into one line. This is not easy to read, but the SQL formatter will take this and make it beautiful with the click of that single button. Let's click the red button and see the result. And this makes my SQL much easier to read. To the left of the box, notice there are 5 different styles to choose from. We're currently on Redgate's default style, but we can also select the commas before style to get something that looks very similar to how I write my SQL. The collapsed style will collapse the SQL so that each clause begins on its own line. Another style that's very popular is the indented style, where the keyword for each clause has its own line, and the SQL that is modified by those keywords is underneath and indented. This makes the SQL very easy to read because it keeps the keywords very distinct from each other. The final style that Redgate offers is right-aligned, which takes the keywords and aligns them so that they are right-justified in the code window. You can see the T in select, the M in from, and the second E in where are all aligned in a straight line. And if you look at our group by and order by clauses, they are also aligned. Meanwhile, the columns under each clause are left aligned to each other, and the equal sign in our where clause are all lined up over each other. This is a very clean appearance. However, doing it manually on your keyboard without the aid of an automated SQL formatter like this can be very tedious. I encourage you to use Redgate's free SQL formatter occasionally during this course and try to figure out what style of SQL suits you the most. Your style will probably evolve over time, as mine has, as mine continues to do. As you're experimenting, just don't mix and match styles in the same SQL query, because it will probably look bizarre, like it was written by 4 different people with totally different styles. Keep your formatting consistent within the same query so it's easier to understand. Now, it's important to note that at some organizations, managers may write a style guide that specifies how they want their developers to style their code. This is a common practice. The organization may specify where they want commas placed, where they want parentheses placed, and even how certain keywords should be aligned. To give you an example of one such style guide, I'm including a link to Simon Hollywell's website called the SQL Style Guide. It's a fantastic example of a well-written style guide for SQL that clearly explains why they chose those particular styles. And with that, that's a wrap on our Week 1 lessons. So far, you've learned how to select data from a table and how to sort the output in different ways using the order by clause. You've learned various methods of filtering the data, whether you're filtering on the column values themselves using the where clause, or filtering on an aggregate function using the having clause. You've learned how to use comparison operators like equal, not equal, greater than, and less than, and you've learned logical operators such as like and not like, in and not in, and between. We've also showed you how to use comments in your code for both testing and documentation. This is a very good start to learning SQL. These are the basics you need to know in order to query data from a single table. In Week 2, we're going to ramp up the complexity by showing you how to query data from multiple tables by joining them to each other.